Hello, everyone. Welcome back to a new episode on our Open to Happiness podcast. I am your host, Nicoleta, and today I will be joined by Stephen Travers, Director of UK and International Havening from Dublin, Ireland. We will be talking about the relationship between trauma and happiness today, and I've said it before many times. This is one of my favorite topics. Hello, Stephen, and very welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Nicoletta. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Thank you for, giving us your time today. So, Stephen, I'd love to start by maybe finding out a little bit about you and your journey in life. What inspired you to actually do this work that you're doing today?
Well, I specialize in trauma therapy. I'm doing it over 20 years, working with thousands and thousands of clients. I'm also an international trainer, which means I train mental health professionals and therapists how to use neuroscientific-based psychological approaches and techniques to help resolve anxiety-based disorders, trauma, and to help people feel happier.
Love that. Right.
Yeah.
How did you end up doing this kind of work? What inspired you? Was there trauma in your or anxiety in your childhood?
A few different things. I was always very curious and interested in psychology. I ended up working in sales and marketing in my 20s, which I really enjoyed. But I wouldn't say I was inspired necessarily to get into this work. It was more through my own pain of having anxiety and trauma myself.
Right. So now I'd love to hear from you. What's your perspective on trauma and happiness first? Can we really be happy after trauma?
Well, I think happiness is overrated in some ways. I remember a colleague said to me, well, he's actually a famous colleague, said to me, I gave up trying to be happy because it was making me sad. So I think happiness, it's an emotion. It's one of many. I think the pursuit of happiness is probably quite futile. Interestingly, I was reading some quotes from Albert Einstein before our podcast, or before our interview today. And he's some very interesting ideas about happiness, Einstein. What's one of them? He said, if you want to be happy, tie it to a goal, not to a person or an object. And he was quite critical about people who were trying to be happy. So I think trying to be happy and pursuing happiness causes people a lot of problems. I find that even working with clients, sometimes people say, I just want to be happy. And it's like, well, that's fine. But the question is, well, why aren't you happy? What's causing the problem? And if you're constantly trying just to be happy, life is more complicated than that. Can we be happy all the time? Should we be pursuing happiness? Is happiness the male goal in life? Is it? I don't know. I don't think so.
Well, let's go deeper then, because I'm questioning this myself in my life, in my practice. So let's go a little bit deeper. If it's no happiness, what we should pursue in life, then what is it? What are we after? What's going on? What's the purpose of everything, really? What's the meaning of this existence?
Yeah, well, I'd be more than modest enough to say I wouldn't have all those answers. Philosophers, psychologists, neuroscientists, over the last years, decades, hundreds, thousands of years, have been trying to figure out those questions, and no one seems to have the answers. But what we do see when we do look at human behavior and psychology is there are things that make people more happier and fulfilled generally in life, such as, some of them are cliches that you'll read in self-help books and even, popular psychology books, but there's certainly some truth to them. For example, doing what you love in life, loving what you do. For an example, many people are doing a career or a job that they're not happy in. You know, they're spending 40, 50 hours a week doing something that's not inspiring, that's not fulfilling, and that sometimes can be very stressful, as opposed to someone who's doing something that they're inspired to do, that they really enjoy doing. And you'll often find that people who are pursuing things that they love and that they enjoy are generally more fulfilled and happier within themselves. But that also means they're often setting goals, and they're often setting challenges for themselves that are important to them, and they're pursuing those things, and they're not letting life just happen to them. They're creating their life, they're designing it, they're getting clear on what's important to them, and then they're setting, you know, high priority actions each day that's aligned to what's important to them, their goals, the things they'd love to achieve, and they're doing things that they really enjoy doing, and then they're aiming to outsource and delegate things that they're not inspired to do to other people. And I suppose that's very much maybe in a business context, but that's just an example of, you know, doing what you love, loving what you do, as a way of helping you feel more happier and fulfilled, as opposed to doing the opposite, maybe.
Very well said. I think I'm in love with the humanistic school of thought myself, you know, finding that amazing potential that exists in every single one of us, and keep searching for what really brings joy and happiness and meaning and purpose in our lives. The question that arises is there room on earth for everyone to actually do what they love? Because the world is currently organized this way, and it functions this way just because there is a lot of programming in our lives, and we do what we feel in a way conditioned to do based on our cultures, on the society when we live in. I'm not sure if there is room for everyone to enjoy what they love doing. I would imagine that there would be occupations and professions that would not have, you know, as much as of an interest from us people. And that would create a lot of imbalance in how the world is running right now and the economy is functioning. But anyhow, it's important to really search for that happiness and seek to do what you love doing. Because none of us is actually in love with only one thing. We love many things. So at least finding one of the things that make us happy and joyful. I would agree with that. Cool. So what is your relationship with happiness now? As a human being, as a professional, as a social being?
Well, as I mentioned, I don't really pursue happiness. I think it's overrated. For me, it's just one of many emotions. I expect to be like human beings, you know, we are positive, we're negative. Life is challenge and support, problems and solutions. It's very difficult to have a one-sided life of all positive things and all good things, or to walk around feeling positive all the time or having positive emotions. Like, I don't know anyone, I've never met anyone in my life, and even so-called gurus and books I've read about, I don't know anyone who's gone around constantly feeling happy, positive, who hasn't had some sort of tragedies, challenges. It's part of life. So I embrace and I recognize that life is going to give me yin and yang. It's going to be dark and light. It's going to be positive. It's going to be negative. Even when I'm pursuing something that's important to me, I know there's going to be challenges and problems in achieving it. So I expect negative things to happen to a degree. Obviously, I want to mitigate them, but it's part of the tapestry of life. You know, it's dark and light. You're going to get both. And I think once you acknowledge that, it makes things in a strange way easier, because you're not going around, you know, expecting everything to be great all the time. And when it isn't, then you're like sad and depressed because you've unrealistic expectations about things.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, you're talking about awareness, really, and awakening to the true nature of our reality.
Hmm.
It's not about really feeling happy all the time. It's about being able to come back into joy and happiness after a moment of distress or duress or some adversity and hardship that we all face in life. It's about not staying trapped into that negative feeling of pain and suffering, not more than it's necessary anyway. If there is some learning in there that we need to extract, that's absolutely fine. But overall, it's about our mental health, how we preserve our mental health. And it's not just about us, because we can make a choice to really feel miserable. That's, no one can take that power from us. But it's about the other people as well, because it's one to be a good workmate, somehow functioning well. It's another one to come at work or come back from work into your own family environment or into your group of friends, feeling really sad and depressed, and then it changes the way we function. It changes the chemistry within our bodies. It changes the way we think about ourselves, our relationships, changes how we feel ourselves in the presence of those people that choose to stay, to get trapped, to get stuck into that negative feeling. It's about really the well-being of the humanity, I think, to an extent. This is how I see it now. You're inspiring me to think this way.
Yes, at the same time, I do acknowledge that part of people's own happiness, if you like, or lack of fulfillment or problems can be related to their past, because we did mention trauma at
Yes.
the beginning. And like, part of it is about resolving past issues, past experiences that have been highly distressful, challenging, or that have traumatized us, and maybe creating problems such as post-traumatic stress, or people are having panic attacks, or they can't sleep because they're overly worried and stressed, and they're in this fight or flight freeze response. So if someone is having those type of symptoms because of past trauma or even present stressors, it's obviously very difficult to be happy, because you have the chemistry of stress going on in your brain. Your cortisol levels are up, norepinephrine is up. You're not having, serotonin, oxytocin, GABA. You're actually in a neurochemical state of distress. And part of the work that I do is really looking at, well, what's causing someone's unhappiness, and then using psychological processes to change the chemistry and to actually delink and remove the emotional stress from their memories, from their trauma. And when we do that, and we downregulate that emotional and physical stress, it's like taking a big weight off their system. It's like going around carrying a bag of bricks and you take it off someone, they naturally and even instantly start feeling better once you start removing the trauma and the anxiety and the stressors. So that's part of it as well. Sometimes it's not about adding things into your life. It's about taking things away and resolving them.
So beautiful. Absolutely. I would completely agree with that. So now, what is your view on trauma? What is trauma in your view?
Well, a lot of my work is based on the latest discoveries in neuroscience. And what we've discovered is that trauma becomes encoded in a part of the brain called the lateral amygdala through a very specific type of a receptor called an AMPA receptor, or trauma receptor, when you have a highly distressing experience or event. And when you're having that distressing experience or event, your brain encodes all the cognitive components of it. That's everything that you're seeing and hearing. All the emotional components, that could be the fear, the anger, the shame that you might be feeling in that moment. All the autonomic components, so if your heart rate's beating really fast, you're sweating, you have a knot in your stomach, your muscles are physically tense, that all gets encoded. And the somatosensory, things like maybe pain or tingling in your skin, all that gets encoded in that traumatic memory or event or experience that you had.
Right.
So that gets encoded in the amygdala through these AMPA receptors, they're called. And if anything reminds you of that event, even thinking about it, or something reminds you of, even unconsciously, some outside stimuli or cue, it fires off these receptors and releases cortisol and adrenaline in your body and creates that fight, flight, freeze reaction and those uncomfortable, distressing feelings.
How do you
So
see it manifesting in people?
almost all anxiety-based disorders are the consequences of past unresolved trauma or traumas. That's what the science is showing us. And if we can pinpoint and identify what's causing those symptoms, that's making someone unhappy or stressed or uncomfortable in their lives in whatever way in the present, if we can clear up those past issues from a neurobiological perspective of where they got encoded and synaptically de-encode them and switch off those neural pathway signals, we can resolve the trauma, which also resolves the symptoms as well.
Mm-hmm. So you're talking about the neurological signs of trauma and the impact of trauma on the brain, on the physical body, or some parts of the physical body, obviously, because we feel it through our physiological sensations in different other parts.
Yes.
What is this trauma doing to us in our social life? How do you see trauma impairing our lives in all aspects of our lives?
Well, trauma comes in many different shapes and forms. Like you often see, for example, people with social anxiety and fear of public speaking and presenting, they often have some sort of negative experiences from those types of situations in the past or when they were younger. For example, if someone had a difficult time in school, maybe reading in the classroom or trying to speak in front of a group, but maybe the teacher was quite harsh with them or they found it very distressing or embarrassing, that association is created there, that neurochemical encoding, and they carry that with them as they get older. So they become fearful of social situations because they perceive them as a threat or a danger, where they could get embarrassed again, or they might get attacked by someone or criticized. So that's the past can affect the present, and that's just one example.
Yes,
because it's obviously very subjective. Like I know people who can stand up. I've actually worked with clients who can stand up in a room in front of hundreds of people and present, and they're brilliant at it. Try and put them in a small group with people in a social situation to start getting anxious, because what's causing that is in relationship to that specific type of situation, as opposed to be standing on a stage with hundreds of people. And it mightn't seem to make sense, but there's a specific trauma or reason, if you like, that's causing that symptom in the context of that situation.
Yeah, I've been working with a couple of clients that have experienced this kind of response to life. In my understanding, it's the proximity to the others in the smaller group that makes the person feel more anxious. Whilst being on the stage, there is a distance created between the speaker and the audience. And there's also a sense of importance and significance in the message they send, where they feel more comfortable. When on the other side, being in a quite small group, where the relationships are more intimate and the dialogue is involving a level of proximity to the other. And it's not just physical closeness, it's the emotional closeness as well, and the mental one, the intellectual closeness to the other, that probably creates a little bit of anxiety. That's what I've noticed myself. So that very, very, really good points. So from your experience now, Stephen, is it hard? Is it difficult to heal trauma? What has been your learning so far?
I suppose one of my understanding from working with thousands and thousands of clients is we've got to pinpoint, identify what's causing the symptoms. And then we use a treatment, like one of our best treatments we use is something called havening, which is a psychosensory treatment. The way havening works is we pinpoint, identify the trauma, we activate those AMPA receptors, we use sensory touch and distraction techniques. The sensory touch produces something called delta waves in the brain through the receptors in the skin. Delta waves occur in slow wave sleep, and the delta waves go inside the neurons with those AMPA receptors or trauma receptors, and it creates a chemical called calcineurin, which dephosphorylates something called phosphate molecule off the AMPA receptors, which means they disappear back into the neurons, and that de-encodes the trauma synaptically. It literally switches off the fight-flight reaction and the stress response in relationship to the traumatic memory. So what that means, if something was really traumatizing someone and distressing them emotionally and physically, after we do a havening treatment on that memory or experience, and it takes only generally about 5-10 minutes, when we bring them back to that memory, the emotional distress and physiological symptoms will be significantly reduced, if not completely gone. And any stimuli or cues that was triggering off that stress reaction within them won't be able to trigger it anymore, because those trauma receptors are now gone. And it's actually called amygdala depotentiation treatment, where you're synaptically depotentiating or switching off that fight or flight reaction by getting rid of those AMPA receptors. Those AMPA receptors are actually the trauma receptors. So that's some of the latest insights and discoveries in the neuroscience of trauma.
So
So
amazing.
havening it's a, if you like, it's a new groundbreaking treatment for anxiety-based disorders and trauma.
That sounds very interesting. I'd love to hear a little bit more about it, because you're talking about using the physicality, the human touch, to actually work on some neural pathways on
Yes.
the brain itself. And through this technique, something is happening that is releasing that kind of trauma that's been trapped there. So the brain reacts differently from that moment, even if it's triggered again, or not triggered, even if it's again in a risky, in a difficult situation that resembles something from the past. That's very interesting how you describe it.
Yeah, we're delinking that pathway, we're disrupting it, so it can't fire anymore. That's what it does.
Right.
And it's permanent and complete. So that neural pathway is literally cut off synaptically, so it can't transmit the electrochemical signal of stress anymore. It's delinked. It's like switching the light off or taking the light bulb out. So when you try and switch it on, the light won't, or the lamp won't light, because the bulb has been removed, or the trauma has been removed from a neurobiological perspective. And those AMPA receptors are the trauma receptors, if you think of them that way. The havening, also the sensory touch, goes back to the idea of when you're born as a child, a baby comes out, it cries, it doesn't want to be abandoned. That's nature kicking in. Oxytocin is produced in the mother's brain. Give me my child. When the baby is put into its mother's arms, the baby knows it's safe. That sensory touch communicates to the baby there that I'm safe now. I'm not going to be abandoned. So there's that extra sensory component to the touch that's hardwired into all humans, of when we're touched and held, that association is there of feeling safe, cared for, not going to be abandoned, loved. And there is all these receptors in your skin. They're called C-tactile receptors. And when you stroke them, they produce these delta waves. But when there's an electrical change in the brain, there's also a chemical change simultaneously. So when deltas produce serotonin, oxytocin, and GABA increase, which are the feel-good calming neurotransmitters, and simultaneously cortisol and adrenaline is decreased through the sensory touch. So your heart rate slows down, your physiological nervous system starts to relax, and you literally start to feel very calm and sleepy, because you're changing the electrochemical landscape of the brain in the moment. With havening as well, or with what you find with some of the Bella trauma treatments, but especially with havening, is we're changing the landscape of the brain. people who are traumatized tend to have a more vulnerable neurochemical landscape, so they're more overly empathetic. They have confidence, self-esteem issues. They'll tend to have maybe, they're more prone to addiction, the problem regulating their emotions. They're overly, as I said, empathetic. So there's certain characteristics you see when people present with trauma. And what we're doing is we're changing the landscape of the brain to make them more resilient, that they can regulate their emotions, so they're more calmer. Their prefrontal cortex is more online, so they can think more clearly, be more strategic, focus, concentrate. But that's all the result of actually healing and removing the trauma. And that's why that's so vital to do that, because if you're going to remove the trauma and clear that out, people will naturally start to feel much better and function much better without it.
I love it. So I'm aware as a therapist myself or psychologist myself that obviously we can use different avenues to healing trauma.
Yes.
I'm a childhood trauma survivor myself, so I've been through this journey as a human being, a person myself, and I'm obviously guiding other people in their own journeys. So we usually use talking therapies as practitioners. We use the conceptual mind to help people to maybe grasp some understanding, reach some acceptance, maybe surrender to what happened, to the reality of what's been happening in the past, maybe learn some lessons, extract some meaning, and then start forgiving, healing. This is the framework I'm using myself. And then the transformation happens when the trauma is starting to heal. Yeah. Because I'm not sure if you can heal it in, completely or in one go. It's not something that it's
you can.
Material. You can.
Yes. Well,
yes.
we can with
yes.
Havening, you can.
Right. You can.
Yeah.
We have, okay, we'll ask about that in a second. So we have this tool, the talking, the mind is used to help with this. Then we have obviously the spiritual side of it, how using the emotions, care, love, compassion, understanding. People that have been traumatized find a lot of soothing in having someone around them that is providing that kind of safety through the emotional, containment and holding. In therapy, we have some very strict, code of ethics. We don't use much touching, it's very limited. That's how it works. Now, I'm aware that you're a trained hypnotherapist. I have trained in hypnotherapy myself for a good number of years, and I don't practice hypnotherapy anymore. I have stopped practicing this. I just wanted to find out if using the Havening technique, is this happening in trance? Is this merged with, is this part of a hypnotherapy ritual, or it's separate?
Havening it's a standalone. It can be combined. Standalone.
Okay.
It can be combined with a lot of, like, we've got psychologists, psychotherapists, EMDR trainers, practitioners, hypnotherapists, counselors.
Right. It's a tool on itself.
Who use Havening. It's really like they use it very much as a bolt-on to what they're doing. But obviously they use it quite a bit because it's incredibly effective. Like, my philosophy when it comes to therapy, I never really tie myself to any modality, because people even talk to me sometimes about evidence-based therapy, and I always say I want results-based therapy. I'm not interested in evidence-based, because I looked at a lot of the evidence-based therapies. The evidence isn't very good for some of them.
Yeah.
The evidence is quite poor. So I kind of find it interesting, that phrase is used like some sort of status. But when you dig deeper, sometimes, people are spending months and years doing evidence-based therapies. So results are what's important. So I'm very practical. I've looked at so many different therapies over the last 2 decades. And the reason why I'm such, I suppose, an advocate of Havening is because so far it's the most effective one I've come across in terms of the results it produces. So I'm very practical that way. And if another therapy comes along that's even better, that's the one I would move to. So I'm very practical that way in how I think about it.
Well, that's really sound, because in a way we need to be open-minded and integrate all the tools that we have available. We can't just be narrow-minded and expect a modality to work with everyone and with every single kind of life challenge. So yeah, I appreciate this. Tell us a little bit more about the results you get through the Heaven techniques. What are the most significant or mind-blowing results that you've had with your clients over the years? Because you mentioned earlier on, you can actually heal trauma completely. So tell us about your results with the Heaven technique.
Yeah, well, if anyone Googles me, first of all, like if they type in Stephen Travers into Google, say havening or even hypnotherapy, you know, there's, like in my Google reviews, I think there's 74 5-star reviews from clients. You can see my website, there's lots of video testimonials for people with severe trauma who've done some treatment. Like most of my programs are like a 4-session program. So I don't see people for months and years. It tends to be 4 sessions, and we're able to get very good results in that period. Sometimes we might do more, depending if there's a lot of other trauma or different issues we work on. You can look at my Facebook business page as well. I think there's 62 reviews there. Just to show people, like if they want to research it, there is social proof out there, and there's demos you can see on my YouTube channel. But to give you an example, like havening is incredibly predictable and consistent in the results it produces in terms of the science behind it. That's why I'm such an advocate of it, because there's an extremely high probability it's going to work. So for example, if someone comes in with a major traumatic memory, it could be they were physically attacked, they were raped, it could be a car accident, it could be some sort of severe emotional or physical abuse they experienced from childhood. Obviously what we do is we pinpoint and we identify that trauma, and that's a big thing. Lots of, I notice therapists don't necessarily do that or know what to aim the treatment at. So there's a certain methodology we use to really clarify, well, where is the trauma and what is the traumatic memory, if you like, that's causing the symptoms. So we'd ask someone to close their eyes when we find the trauma, bring up the event, scale it like a lot of therapists do in 0 to 10. 10 is extremely distressed, 0 is completely calm. So we'd ask them to close their eyes, go back into the memory. Most people will be at least a 6, even right up to a 10 on that memory, and they will feel it. They will emotionally might get a bit upset. They might feel angry, fearful, whatever the emotion is. They will often feel it in their body. Some people can get a little bit tearful. We do that from a neurobiological perspective because we have to activate those AMPA receptors that are on the neurons. Once they're activated, there's a phosphate molecule that's exposed, that's holding them there, that we can now get at. But once we activate it, it takes about 10 to 30 seconds. We ask them to clear their mind. We don't keep them in the trauma, and we bring them into the safe place with the touch. So we start the havening touch, and we use the distraction techniques, like walking on a beach or counting backwards or humming a song, because the distraction displaces the traumatic memory out of their working memory. And what's happening when we're using the touch is helping the client feel calmer, more relaxed, that feeling again of being in a safe place. But from a neuroscientific perspective, the delta waves are entering the neurons with the AMPA receptors. Think of my hand as a neuron. These are the receptors. And as the delta waves enter, they create calcineurin. It's an enzyme inside the neurons in the amygdala. And the calcineurin dephosphorylates, which means it removes the AMPA receptors off the neurons in the amygdala. It generally takes an average about 7 to 10 minutes to completely remove the receptors. After each round of havening we do, which takes about a minute per round or a minute and a half, we ask the client what number are they on the scale. So, you know, we say, now think of what number comes to mind, where are you now on that distress? And the client will say, I'm a 3, I'm a 2, I'm a 5. until we get it to 0. We can generally get it to 0 in the majority of cases. And once it's at a 0, obviously the feeling's gone, but then we do a very thorough debrief where we bring them back to the memory after it, and we really check to see that the trauma, all the components, the emotional, the somatosensory, the cognitive, autonomic components are gone. So what you'll often find is clients will see the memory off in the distance, or they'll see them blanker, or it'll be from the outside looking in, and the emotional distress will be completely delinked from it.
Are these results lasting? Have you followed maybe clients over the years, over the decades, to see if they have ever returned back to the same kind of feeling around their trauma? Or are you positive that all the people you have treated have never experienced that level of distress when they thought about their trauma following this havening technique?
Well, I think that's an impossible question to answer, because I can't speak from the thousands of people I worked with. I couldn't say 110% absolutely. Like, we don't follow people for 10, 20 years and keep checking with them. I don't know any therapist that does that, but we know from maybe working with someone that maybe over the course of a month or two, and from, like, havening was created back in 2001 by my good colleague, Dr. Ronald Rudin. And we know and there's been some studies and research done in havening as well. We know it's permanent we understand the neuroscience, so we know how that works. And then if I'm working with a client and maybe it's 5 weeks later or 6 weeks or a month later, I can, we see the transformation and change. And we can say to the client, be it a month later, go back to that memory now that was highly traumatic, and try and think of it again and bring up the trauma, and they won't be able to. When we clear something that's a massive trauma that they might have done tons of therapy on already through other things, we will say to people, close your eyes and do your best to try and get the trauma back. So we will push it just to, I suppose, illustrate that the change is permanent and complete. So we can do that within the session, and we can follow it up weeks and even months later. And it will be the same. Plus, we know, like, I know from myself from my own clinic and from the work I do, the amount of referrals we get and feedback we get, and then from all my colleagues around the world, we all have the same story, who are using the havening specifically in terms of the results it's producing. So the evidence, if you like, or the results speak for themselves.
That's very promising, and I'm really excited to hear about a new tool that we have available in healing trauma. I feel that based on my own life and work experience, many people are suffering from all sorts of traumatic experiences, and I personally encourage everyone to acknowledge their pain, to just be true to themselves. If you're listening and watching now, just invest in your self-discovery. Learn to be present, learn to find ways of healing and growing into the person that you most want to become. That's so important, because then you will tap into the joy and happiness that is already existent in you. And from there onwards, you will know the path towards rebalancing your life. So now, towards the end of the podcast, Stephen, thank you so much for sharing all of this with us and our listeners. What are your best learnings so far from life and work? And can you share maybe 1, 2, 3 tips for all the listeners and watchers? What can they do themselves to heal their traumas if they are not in therapy, if they don't go for any of these techniques?
Okay, well, I suppose there's a couple of things. Like I suppose these days, my philosophy and the main tip I can give people, and we spoke about it at the very start, so we're kind of coming from full circle on it, is, I suppose, to pursue, if you like, doing what you love and loving what you do. I think that's such a fundamental thing in life. Getting there can be challenging. if you're in a situation in your life where you're not happy or you're not inspired, it could be a job, a relationship, or things aren't where you want them to be. But I think that's such a worthwhile pursuit, because if you can, find that and realize and discover that, that can make a huge difference to your life and for the rest of your life. Doing what you love, loving what you do. So that's the best tip I can give people. And I do appreciate it's easier said than done. But as you said, be curious, discover, look for insights and work on yourself. If you're a therapist or mental health professional and you want to find out more about havening, we're actually doing a free introduction to havening live online on September the 8th. And it's going to include a live demo on a traumatic memory. So that's for mental health professionals who want to discover more about havening. In terms of helping people deal with stress, anxiety, trauma, what I can do right now is show you how to do a little bit of havening. Everyone can do it as we watch it. We're not going to work on any major trauma, but we can do the havening touch, which is very calming and soothing, and it's very good for down-regulating general stress and helping build resiliency. So you can actually now get an experience of it. If we want, we can do it together, and your audience or anyone watching the video can follow along. Very simple of what we would do would be a little bit of havening touch, and just think of something calming and just give people the experience of what it actually feels like, if you want to do that.
I wonder if you have any videos that they can watch on your website. Can you maybe share with our listeners and watchers where can they find a little bit more about you and the havening technique, maybe some social media accounts, a website, whatever might be helpful?
Yeah, fine. If you go to my website, stravershypnosis.com, there's videos there. If they click on the icon, the YouTube channel, it'll be brought to my YouTube channel. There's television interviews there I've done about havening, which are quite insightful. And then there's some demos and videos. There's a video which you can follow along, and there's some havening as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Stephen. It's been such a wonderful conversation, but it is time to stop now. A big thanks to all of you listening, and many, many thanks to you, Stephen, for joining us here today.
Okay, thank you, Nicoletta.
That's it for now. Until next time, we are wishing you all good health and happiness.